I love Students for Liberty. Students for Liberty is such an awesome organization, and it is a real privilege to be here once again with this group of the next generation of the Liberty Movement's leaders. This organization cannot get enough credit, I think, for the amazing things it does. You know, I started out life like I think a lot of libertarians of my generation, which is to say that I had Goldwater voting parents, I read science fiction, I programmed computers, and I was socially awkward. And I was set on a pretty conventional trajectory, I think, toward becoming a libertarian activist in college and afterward, libertarian academic. And I got derailed, and the details don't matter much, but I got derailed onto a fairly long and unfortunate detour into a pretty conventional kind of statism. And it really wasn't until the successive disasters of the George W. Bush and Barack Obama administrations radicalized me, and I rediscovered some amazing libertarian resources that I hadn't, or I discovered for the first time some resources I really hadn't been aware of as an adolescent, that I re-entered the libertarian movement and was re-energized by it. The reality is that if there had been an organization like Students for Liberty that could have provided me with the resources I needed to help me understand how libertarian ideas, libertarian institutions could help to deal with the complex problems that confront our society and our world today, if there had been that kind of organization, my life would have been very different. I'm so delighted that people here have the opportunity to participate in the flourishing, thriving dialogue that happens courtesy of Students for Liberty. It's such an honor to be here. I'm so thankful to all those, certainly to Clark and to Encore and to Mariah, who helped to make this possible. It's just such a privilege. So you won't be surprised then by the thesis of my remarks today. Students for Liberty can change the world. As much as any organization I can think of, SFL has demonstrated the ability to mobilize and energize a new generation of leaders who understand that a commitment to personal freedom, peace, and free markets is a radical commitment that can liberate and transform our society and our world. This has been, you might not think so initially, but it has, a great year for a message of liberation. You might not know that from the electoral insanity of the last few months, as two corporatist warmongers competed with each other for the dubious privilege of being able to kill teenagers with drones. But the message of liberty isn't about who captures the state apparatus, about who gets to exercise top-down control over the rest of us. It's about making the warmongers and the power trippers and the regulators and the political hacks irrelevant. It's about building a new, free society within the shell of the old, and that's happening. That's happening. Whatever the protestations of the centrist establishmentarians, whatever the declarations of apologists for executive power and legislative micromanagement of our lives, whatever the sonorous pronouncements of the serious people in Washington, in increasing numbers, Americans know that more of the same isn't nearly enough. That those in power aren't their friends, and that the experts and the managers and the leaders don't, shouldn't, can't run our society for us. Think about what we've seen. From large-scale bailouts to crony-ish deals with firms like Solyndra and sweetheart contracts with stars of the military-industrial complex like Halliburton, it is obvious that politicians, even the ones who say they support the interests of ordinary people, are almost always passionately interested in feeding your tax dollars to their corporate cronies. If you haven't seen it before, I urge you to visit a Facebook group called Exposing Progressive Corporatism. Despite the name, it's not just about progressives, it's about all of those who claim to exercise power in our name. Anybody here been to that page, Exposing Progressive Corporatism? Check it out. you'll find a host of Venn diagrams highlighting the overlap between various interest groups, especially major industry groups, and the federal government. The site identifies an enormous number of people who straddle the corporate and political worlds. Here are just a few drawn from the last few years. The lists go farther back than this. Monsanto's Vice President for Public Policy, Obama's Deputy FDA Commissioner. The Chair of the Federal Trade Commission, sometime VP for Congressional Affairs of the Motion Picture Association of America. Two Goldman Sachs CEOs, John Corzine and Henry Paulson, headed the Department of the Treasury under George W. Bush. The Wall Street firm has been exceptionally well represented in the Obama administration, with its chief counsel, Gregory Craig, serving as White House counsel, its sometime Vice President for Business Intelligence, Adam Storch, serving as managing executive of the SEC's Enforcement Division, a former lobbyist, Mark Patterson, serving as Treasury Department Chief of Staff, former government affairs analyst Alexander Lasry, and former Vice President for Environmental Policy Sonal Shah, both serving on the White House staff, and its co-head of finance, Gary Gensler, chairing the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Deputy Interior Secretary David Hayes is a former lobbyist for General Cigar Holdings. Dennis Hightower, sometime GE Vice President and General Manager, served as Deputy Secretary of Commerce until 2010. British Petroleum's Chief Scientist, Stephen Coonan, went on to serve as Deputy Secretary of Energy in the Obama administration. No conflict of interest there at all. Barack Obama named GE CEO Jeffrey Immelt chair of the administration's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness. Go figure. Deputy Secretary of Defense William Lynn is defense contractor Raytheon's former senior vice president for government operations. Government operations, of course, meaning lobbying. Roger Beachy, director of the Department of Agriculture's National Institute of Food and Agriculture, former director of Monsanto's Danforth Center. Ignacio Moreno, formerly an attorney with GE's Corporate Environmental Program, now serves as Assistant Attorney General. Pfizer CEO Jeffrey Kendler sits on the board of the influential New York Federal Reserve Bank. Deputy Secretary of Commerce Dennis Hightower is a former senior executive at Disney. And, oh, don't forget this, Keystone Pipeline lobbyist Roderick Johnson served as a senior advisor to the Obama re-election campaign. The Obama administration's keynote legislative accomplishment, the Affordable Care Act, features the requirement, set to be phased in, as we know very soon, that people purchase policies from the very insurance corporations often treated as the official villains in public narratives about health care. Fancy that. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is not to take seriously politicians' stump speeches about their opposition to corporate power. At the same time, as corporatism thrives, attacks on our freedom continue. The Patriot Act hasn't been repealed. The TSA continues to keep us from seeing our friends off at the airport. Supercomputers devour our email messages and phone calls in search of incriminating information. Detention without trial at Guantanamo Bay persists. Bradley Manning rots in a cell, accused of telling the truth to the American people, and torture continues. Worst of all, military action is ongoing on multiple fronts, from Libya to Iraq to Afghanistan, with new opportunities for U.S. military intervention contemplated in Syria and in Africa, and calls by neocons and others for an attack on Iran in order to end the nuclear weapons program, for the existence of which there is simply no good evidence. The administration has proudly trumpeted not only its extrajudicial murder of Osama bin Laden, but also its imposition of crippling sanctions, their words, on the people of Iran. The empire is out of control. The system is the problem, not the solution. So many people increasingly realize that tweaking the dials on the imperial control panel isn't what's needed. At the same time, it's obvious that new technologies are making it possible for people to network with each other as never before, to route around state control and create alternate communities, alternate institutions that can do for them what the centers of power simply can't. So it's a great time to be part of Students for Liberty as the awareness that the emperor has no clothes becomes more and more widespread. I believe in particular, and here's where I want to focus for a few minutes, that SFL can play a vital role in helping libertarians reach out to, mobilize, engage with the Occupy movement. As libertarian and occupier, J.L. Akram, whom I'm so pleased to see here on the front row this morning, notes, Occupy has been a grand experiment in non-aggression and voluntary cooperation, a model for the kind of society both libertarians and occupiers would like to build. And libertarians should recognize that occupiers have correctly identified a range of serious problems. But I hope that in turn, SFL can help some occupiers to find libertarian responses, libertarian solutions to these problems, appealing and helpful. I'm happy to identify as both a lefty and a libertarian. I think there's common ground with regard to multiple issues on which I don't plan to focus today. I believe large numbers of libertarians and occupiers agree on the need to oppose war and the national security state, to support civil liberties, and to call for an end to the senseless, unjust, racist war on drugs. And like many, many other libertarians, I certainly favor abortion rights and sexual freedom and marriage equality, while unequivocally rejecting prejudice and bigotry rooted in how people look, where they were born, what they're like anatomically, or who they're sexual with. But I think it may make sense to focus primarily today on economic issues, especially on ones related to elite privilege. To anticipate, libertarians, I think, believe that the problems the occupation has rightly identified are rooted in state-sanctioned violence and state-secured privilege, and that the solution is therefore not to strengthen the state, not to give the state more things to do, more opportunities to run our lives, but to eliminate the privilege and provide remedies for the violence. Now, it's worth noting that the kind of collaboration I have in mind has happened before. 4 decades ago, libertarians built a thriving alliance with the New Left that focused on the twin issues of war and the draft, of aggressive violence and slavery to the state. It was fruitful and exciting, but it fractured for a whole host of reasons, including the fact that some people on the New Left rejected the ideal of a peaceful, voluntary society and embraced revolutionary violence. Think the Weathermen. That wasn't true of everyone. It wasn't true of New Leftists who were also libertarians, heroes of mine like Karl Hess and Carl Oglesby. Unfortunately, not everyone in the alliance fit their profile. And the New Left's characteristic commitment to decentralization, its opposition to hierarchy and authoritarianism, didn't seem to persist as its members grew older and joined the establishment and started trying to use the system to achieve their goals instead of hanging on to their recognition that the system was itself the problem. Individual libertarians and libertarian institutions reached out to the left, for instance via Inquiry magazine in the 1970s and early 1980s, but there was no concerted attempt to rebuild the alliance that Hess and Mr. Libertarian Murray Rothbard had sought to construct. Perhaps it's not very surprising that there wasn't. After all, when a president whose conservative opponents tarred him as a representative of the protest movements of the 60s, Bill Clinton, took office in 1993, a president a superficial, non-insightful observer might mistakenly have seen as a product of the New Left. Never mind the fact that, quite probably, like Barack Obama, he was a CIA asset informant on anti-war protesters. That president made sure everyone knew he wasn't really a peacenik. Far from it. He made sure by committing American troops to a pointless conflict in Somalia, by involving the U.S. military in an imperial war in the Balkans, by bombing a pharmaceutical plant in the name of fighting terrorism, by continuing the embargo that caused the deaths of vast numbers of Iraqi children, deaths his Secretary of State famously described as worth it. One of the worst things an American politician has ever said, and by the way, when she said that, she was still UN ambassador. It was only after she declared that the sanctions that caused enormous suffering on the ground of ordinary people in Iraq were worth it, that she was made Secretary of State. Go figure. That same president, whose conservative critics damned him as a pot-smoking longhair, sanctimoniously defended the drug war, including, by the way, if you don't know this, his decision to support his own brother's imprisonment for peaceful drug-related conduct. Given how little he really identified with the counterculture,
with which his attackers sought to associate him, it's hard not to ask, who cares whether or not he inhaled? He'd spent more time inhaling and less time killing. That same president gave us the murder. That same president gave us the murder of peaceful people at Waco and the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which paved the way for the Patriot Act. Conservatives also claim to see evidence of the New Left's influence on Barack Obama's presidential campaign. I don't know, and I really don't care very much, whether former weatherman Bill Ayers ghost wrote Dreams from My Father. What I do know is that when he assumed office, Obama seemed, as he still seems, absolutely committed to serving out George Bush's third term and now his fourth. How anybody can think this has anything to do with the legacy of the New Left is beyond me. There were more bailouts, more giveaways to corporate cronies, and worst of all, more surveillance, more torture, more state secrets, more war. The Obama administration has launched the most aggressive attack on whistleblowers in my memory, in my lifetime. The administration that said it favored transparency is committed to crushing anyone who tells the truth about what it's doing. It's hardly surprising that establishment Democrats have sought to co-opt the occupation in the interests of Obama's re-election campaign. That's over now, so I'm sure they'll forget. Just as Dick Armey and others attempted to make the Tea Party their own. But I'm confident that occupiers, the smart ones at any rate, get the point that establishment politicians aren't their friends, that the system isn't the solution. And of course they're right. The problem isn't this or that politician, but the state itself. Abuse by the state isn't a bug, it's a feature. That's why libertarians can say to occupiers, freedom is right. It works. You should embrace it, and you don't have to give up what you care about in order to do it. Libertarians care about things that matter to you, and you can and should achieve your goals using libertarian means. It should be clear to occupiers that the president isn't on their side, Congress isn't on their side, the Supreme Court isn't on their side, and too many activist groups have been defanged by the con job that's persuaded them that Obama really wants to do the right thing, really wants to, if they'll just give him a little time and keep supporting him. What did he say? Let's get the job done. No. What the administration has done is to sell principled lefties a bill of goods, convincing them that somehow it is committed to pursuing their agenda in Washington. Revisit that list of corporate cronies and ask if this sounds like the kind of administration the president's supporters say they want. The reality is the Obama administration can't give occupiers, can't give principled lefties what they want, but libertarians can. If you're a principled leftist who cares about corporate privilege, the politicians and judges and professional activists aren't in your corner. So who are you going to call? Who are you going to call? Bailout busters, privilege busters, students for liberty. Yeah. Now, as you think about ways of crafting coalitions, ways of making relationships happen, you're going to quickly discover, if you haven't already, that that message, which I think is absolutely right, may well come as a surprise to some occupiers. By design, there has been no formal program or platform for the Occupy movement. But it's clear that there are key concerns that grab the attention of many, perhaps almost all occupiers. The concentration of wealth, the abuse of power, growing economic insecurity. And unfortunately, mistakenly, but I think given the state of public rhetoric in this country, understandably, some, albeit by no means all occupiers, tend to associate these problems with something they call the free market. Now we know it's not the free market. It's a market that is riddled by ongoing privilege. It is a market that is distorted by vast programs of state-sanctioned theft and violence. But if you listen to the talking heads on TV night after night, you'll hear them talk about our free market system, the free market system we have today. as if somehow the set of arrangements we confronted in this society had anything to do with the ideal of a genuinely free market. It's not at all surprising, unfortunately, that this mistake persists. Pundits and apologists for the corporatocracy repeatedly talk blithely and uncritically about the free market system we have now or something equally silly. So when libertarians say they're for markets, occupiers may hear them as implying that they're unconcerned about poor people and are really just shills for big business. They don't get the crucial points that being pro-market and being pro-business aren't the same thing, and that just because you don't think the state ought to be doing something doesn't mean you don't think social institutions can do it. Because of the gap between a genuinely liberated market and what we have now, some of us actually prefer to talk about freed markets, liberated markets, to emphasize that freeing the markets has nothing to do with validating existing injustices. The market we have now is riddled with privilege. It is anything but free. And libertarians, principled libertarians, are passionately committed to abolishing privilege and remedying injustice. We believe doing those things can play a vital role in addressing the Occupy movement's fundamental concerns. Radical libertarians are anything but pot-smoking Republicans, or stooges for the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers. Treasuring freed markets means constantly being on the side of the fence with those who oppose privileges, especially for the financial elite. Libertarians are very much aware that it was Adam Smith, heard of Adam Smith, who said, people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. That's what Adam Smith said. If you think that Adam Smith, who is the prototypical enthusiast for markets in our society, was onto something, then you won't think that a system that's riddled with privilege is one for which we ought to have any enthusiasm. The Occupy movement reflects a set of genuine grievances with elite misbehavior, for which libertarians can provide effective solutions. I've been really pleased with the chance to communicate with SFL board member Pericles Niarchos, who has been actively involved in Occupy Philadelphia. He emphasizes that some other occupiers were initially suspicious of him as a libertarian, but now he says that people realize we all care about the same issues. Things are much more conversation-based. And that's the point. Emphasizing that we care about the same problems and that we can offer effective solutions to those problems organized around our opposition to state-secured privilege and state-sanctioned aggression. Some occupiers talk about the conflict between the 1% and the 99%, as if their concern were simply with relative differences in wealth. And that, taken as it reads, is just a mistake. The crucial factors here are the sources of elite wealth and the continued impact of state-sanctioned violence and state-secured privilege on the distribution of wealth. As the great Sheldon Richman of the Future of Freedom Foundation puts it so bluntly, Wall Street couldn't have done it alone. The crony-ish relationships between the financial and political elites that the great Murray Rothbard chronicled powerfully in Wall Street, Banks, and American Foreign Policy. It's fairly short, it's an easy read, Google it. Wall Street, Banks, and American Foreign Policy play a vital role in explaining the inequities occupiers rightly protest. Bottom line is that the state is the problem. It continually redistributes wealth upward to the wealthy and well-connected. It serves the interests of those who acquire and maintain wealth through political privilege, those whom, following C. Wright Mills, we might call the power elite. The concentrated wealth of the power elite results precisely from the chummy relationship between business elites on the one hand and politicians on the other. The vast majority of politicians are not on your side. This comes as a shock, I know. They're ultimately on the side of the wealthy and well-connected. Either they're wealthy and well-connected themselves, or they seek to become so using their political offices, or they're in the pockets of those who are. And history shows that they have consistently used efforts designed, supposedly, to promote the public interest to benefit the corporate elite. You know, if you're bored, I urge you to go out and find two books. The Triumph of Conservatism by Gabriel Kalko, and a second book by Butler Schaefer, great libertarian law professor at Southwestern University, which has a title that's now escaping me. The older I get, the less well my memory works. But both of these books look at the way in which business elites captured and used the regulatory process in restraint of trade, the business campaign against competition. That's the Butler-Schaefer book. Used the regulatory process to minimize or eliminate competition and benefit themselves at the expense of the public. It's a really remarkable story. But the bottom line here is that businesses, big businesses in America in this period, not just this period, but that's what the story is about, were really interested in cartelizing. Why? Because if they cartelized, if they fostered relationships and agreements among themselves, they would be able to hold prices up. They would be able to exclude those who wanted to outcompete them and thus benefit the public. Now, there's always a problem, obviously. As the great social scientist Mansur Olson has pointed out, there is always a temptation to defect from a cartel. People inside the cartel want to defect because if they can outcompete others in the cartel, especially if others in the cartel don't know about it, by George, they'll make more profits. And of course, people outside the cartel have an obvious incentive to compete against the cartel. So what state actors can do then for the business elites who face this problem is to make the cartel legally mandatory. If you make a cartel legally mandatory, the practical effect will be that people won't be able to defect and outsiders won't be able to compete and profits will stay up and the public will be screwed. And so what Kalko, a new left historian, and Schaefer, a libertarian law professor, both highlight in their respective historical narratives is the way in which people used government power, got government-secured privilege to get around this problem. So the power of the elite depends ultimately on privileges granted and maintained by the state. It is entirely compatible with a free market agenda to relentlessly oppose these privileges. In fact, it's more than compatible with that agenda. It is an essential part of that agenda. Without the state, elites wouldn't have legally secured privileges. They wouldn't be able to hold on to stolen assets, and competition would erode their wealth. With the state's help, by contrast, they can rest secure. A broad range of legal rules and institutions create wealth for privileged elites at the expense of everyone else. Peaceful, voluntary exchange in the context of a genuinely free market tends to share the wealth, to disperse prosperity widely. And that means it tends to make the wealthy and well-connected insecure. If they can't keep satisfying customers, remember von Mises' point about the centrality of the consumer, they'll go out of business. And even if they're able to stay in business, competition will drive down their prices, making consumers better off while leaving them with less and less profit. So no wonder former Archer Daniels Midland President Dwayne Andreas famously observed, I'm paraphrasing, "Our competitors are our friends, the customers are our enemies." Because customers want low prices, not high profits for producers. The wealthy and well-connected want to be insulated against the corrosive effects of freedom. They want to be free to compete with others, but they don't want anyone to be free to compete with them. And that's where the state comes in. The state can steal on the elite's behalf. It can create and maintain privileges that benefit the wealthy and well-connected. It can erect seemingly neutral barriers to entry that insulate established players against competition. It's crucial to emphasize the difference between property rights, as libertarians understand them, and what Thomas Hodgkin, a great libertarian thinker from England from the early part of the 19th century and a mentor to Herbert Spencer, called artificial property rights created by political fiat. Libertarians don't want to return to feudalism. They understand property rights simply as a set of rules designed to prevent conflict by determining priority of access rights to a given piece of finite, scarce physical reality. There's nothing magical or mystical about that. They believe that unowned physical objects can be acquired by labor and that owned property can be transferred through peaceful, voluntary exchange. And it's worth emphasizing, libertarians certainly recognize that the just claimant of a particular piece of property can be a group as well as an individual. By contrast, the state arbitrarily confers property rights on its cronies, stealing from ordinary people for the benefit of corporate cronies and wealthy elites. And this happens, obviously, in our world, especially with eminent domain schemes that take ordinary people's property and hand them over to Pfizer or Walmart or other well-connected companies. But it's happened in a variety of ways in the past, in a variety of cultures, the state repeatedly steals to benefit its allies. So, for instance, to make a more controversial point, though one that's, I think, growing in popularity among libertarians, intellectual property is, I think, a creation of state power. It channels resources to people with politically granted monopolistic privileges, it reduces innovation, it concentrates wealth, and enhances corporate power. State control over coining money is not necessary as a source of financial stability or monetary integrity, quite the opposite, in fact, but it enables government to impose what amounts to a hidden tax by inflating the currency at will and to fund destructive projects, notably large-scale wars. Capitalization requirements and other regulations limit access to the banking business and thus increase the costs of capital and the profits of bankers. Tariffs boost the profits of domestic producers at the expense of consumers and foreign producers and make it easier for domestic producers to cartelize by insulating them from competition. Tariffs also hurt poor people by significantly increasing the cost they need to pay for imported goods, including, often enough, food needed for good health that would be less expensive than domestic alternatives absent import duties. Though often touted as propping up poor workers' incomes, tariffs serve primarily to boost the profits of poorly performing domestic producers at the expense of both domestic producers, especially domestic consumers, especially poor ones, and foreign producers. Vast tax expenditures on transportation infrastructure subsidize business with long-distance shipping models. Government-mandated business and professional licensing drives up the profits of those with licenses, from physicians and lawyers to holders of New York taxi cab medallions. Hundreds of thousands of dollars for a taxi cab medallion. While unnecessarily reducing the options and the resources of those who take advantage of their sources, or do in the same way accreditation requirements for hospitals and similar facilities drive up the cost of health care. Ending licensing and zoning requirements, building codes, and minimum wages will represent a dramatic shift of income to poor people whose costs of living will be reduced and who will be able to earn more because they will be able either to work for others or to start small businesses when they otherwise couldn't. At the same time, however, doing so will represent a shift in power, a shift in the way society works, because privilege won't be what's dominant. Also important, of course, would be the reversal of the effects of massive theft on the part of the state. And the success of mutual aid networks in the past suggests that where economic insecurity and deprivation persisted, despite the elimination of privilege and the rectification of problems created by past injustice, people could care effectively for each other without any involvement by the state, if the state would simply get out of their way. You know, if you take a look at this great book, After the Welfare State, here, that SFL has helpfully provided, you'll see articles there by David Beto and David Green, probably the most important libertarian commentators on this topic. Beto and Green emphasize the ways in which mutual aid networks performed amazing roles in providing vital social support at amazingly low costs in the era before state-provided social welfare schemes. What happened? Did everybody discover that those state-provided schemes were better? No, the state, in one way or another, put the providers out of business. Probably most importantly, for those of you who don't know the story, is what happened with healthcare. Mutual aid networks, fraternal societies, managed to provide extremely low-cost healthcare to people in late 19th and early 20th century America. It was possible to get decent medical access for the equivalent of about 1 day's salary per year. Because of economies of scale and because competition drove down prices. But of course, because the prices were driven down, well-connected groups in the medical establishment protested, made sure that they used the increasing power of state medical boards to threaten people with the removal of their licenses if they continued to provide medical services to these fraternal organizations. And at the same time, when state-supported medical insurance programs went into effect, in one way or another, these programs were used to, in one way or another, undercut, undermine, put out of business the fraternal alternative. Libertarians also believe in another program that's absolutely vital to combating global poverty: immigration freedom. We can remind occupiers that we believe in free markets, and we therefore believe passionately that peaceful people should be free to make agreements with anyone they choose, and that government bureaucrats and cops should be able to stop people from engaging in voluntary transactions just because they don't have government-issued papers. Libertarians believe we don't need the government's permission to move or to work, and principled leftists should see that that makes us their allies. Eliminating privilege would also help to do something, I think, about the insecurities and indignities that make the world of work so unpleasant. With living costs lower, barriers to entry reduced, and mutual aid schemes available as sources of security, people would have better work lives. They would have more leverage when they negotiated contract terms with employers, and it would be less expensive and less risky than it is now for them to work for themselves or to opt for co-ops or partnerships rather than corporate jobs. Being a libertarian means, I think, among other things, that you don't like to be pushed around. It's about as basic as I can imagine. And you don't like seeing other people pushed around. Getting the state out of the marketplace can increase the odds that people won't be pushed around at work, and we can and should help principled leftists see this as yet another way in which libertarianism supports their concerns. Occupiers obviously aren't enthusiastic about the authoritarianism and inefficiency that go along with statist solutions to social problems. And many of them, I'm sure, see the collusion between the state and privileged elites. But they may find it difficult to see alternatives. Occupiers too often assume that the rhetoric of freedom is really being deployed to justify privilege. They think of libertarians as apologists for the well-connected, not as radicals with a message of liberation for everyone. Why I wish they could meet more participants in SFL. That's where we've got to take the offensive. We can and must insist confidently and proudly that there is nothing at all about libertarianism that commits libertarians to favoring corporate power or intrusive bosses or to being unconcerned about destitution and economic insecurity. Rather, the key point is that it is ineffective, inefficient, dangerous, and unjust to try to use state aggression to address these problems. If we can help occupiers to see this point, then on the economic front, they can embrace the freedom movement's agenda, just as they can with respect to personal freedom and war. A libertarian approach to things that trouble occupiers in the economic realm will be effective, if we just have time and opportunity to explain, because it removes the props that keep the elite powerful. It is less dangerous than alternative statist approaches because it won't vest more power in the state to infringe on our autonomy and control our lives. It will be less inefficient because involving the state in trying to restrain corporate power, even if it were well-intentioned, which it almost certainly wouldn't be, would be problematic because the state can't in principle, do the kinds of things its supporters want it to do. It can't manage the economy. And it avoids injustice because it is wrong of the state to claim authority over people without their consent. And we haven't consented. I haven't. And I'm betting no one here has either. Anybody want to raise his or her hand and say, I consent to the state? To letting the state control our bodies and our possessions in order, supposedly, to improve our lives. Libertarians and occupiers are on the same team when it comes to the basic goals of eliminating corporate power and privilege, protecting consumers, and dealing with economic insecurity. Some leftists seem to think the state is somehow vital to dealing with poverty, corporate power, and risks to consumers, but libertarians know and can readily explain how concerns like these can be addressed without the state, can indeed be addressed more satisfactorily when state-secured privileges are eliminated. So here's the message I hope SFL will take to the Occupy movement. If you want to find political allies who despise corporatism, the privilege that creates the divide between the 1% and the 99%. It's about privilege, it's not about distribution. You found them right here. This is where you belong. Here, where you can explore and implement peaceful, non-authoritarian means of achieving social and economic goals we both share. The state isn't the answer. Freedom, peaceful, voluntary cooperation, that's the answer. We share your commitment to participation and decentralization and grassroots organization, and precisely because we do, we believe you have every reason to stand with us against statist solutions that keep people from managing their own lives. We know it's long past time to rebuild the alliance crafted by Murray Rothbard and Karl Hess. There's no reason at all, to keep supporting the establishment politicians who promise everything and deliver nothing. The state is the problem, not the solution. As libertarians, we can say to occupiers, we reject aggressive violence, and we want to work together with you to make a society rooted in nonviolent, voluntary cooperation a reality. Let's work together to change the world.
Schedule. We have a couple minutes, we have like 4 minutes if anyone has any questions. Or
Sure. My favorite libertarian occupier, what's up?
I have a question, Professor Chartier. So what can people do? You talk about the speaking to occupiers, for example. There's a lot of youth organizations out there that are trying to foster some sort of political revolution in DC. It's kind of DC-centric, I thought. What can the conservative libertarian groups do to foster a cultural revolution? Because what's happening, we're watching stuff on television, we're watching stuff on movies. I mean, there's that movie Argo that just came out, which is basically a war propaganda.
Right.
So what can we do to foster the other side of it? Which is it important to foster a cultural revolution?
Well, I don't think change will happen unless the culture changes, right? I mean, if those of us in this room figure out some great ideas, that's not going to be enough. Ultimately, there have to be real shifts in values, real shifts in beliefs across the culture about whether we need state power to make our lives better enough. Because as long as people fear that without the state, they're helpless. Without the state, they're going to be impoverished and violent gangs are going to be patrolling their streets, we're not going to see a change. I really appreciate the emphasis you placed on the problem with a DC-centric focus. I don't think that people who spend their time in DC, like Clark, are wasting their time. I'm delighted that they're there raising consciousness, but I also recognize that if we continue to think that the way to solve the problem is in one way or another to change the minds of the jailers rather than getting out of jail, we have a problem. If we continue to think that the goal, even worse, is to become the jailers, that's even worse. The reality is we have to increasingly try, and there's a lot more to be said about this, and other people who are better at saying it than I am. I think there's a lot to be said for agorist strategies whose purpose is to help people undermine and do without the state, rather than, alternatively, simply focusing their political activism on changing the state. A lot of complementary strategies are appropriate. I don't object to electoral strategies. I don't think they're in principle immoral. I think they can sometimes be effective, but as my involvement with issues Vote for Nobody campaign suggests, I think they're often not very effective. Education matters, building alliances matter. Simply being friends in the right way matters. What people don't need is somebody who wants to be a friend in order to convert them. That's a pretty ineffective strategy. But if you build friendships among political activists with an eye to focusing on specific areas of common concern, let's say drug legalization or the anti-war movement, and then find ways of demonstrating to people there that your position helps to make sense of their concerns, and then in light of your position, it's not appropriate to interfere with peaceful voluntary exchange in other areas of the economy any more than it's right to do so as regards peaceful voluntary exchange of marijuana. It's just one of the odd things that you have areas like that in which folks often on the statist left are happy to oppose state interference in a few areas without seeing that to be consistent, they ought to approach everything in the same way. So I think the idea is to push the idea of peaceful voluntary cooperation through a range of complementary strategies. And if you want to find out how to do that in connection certainly with the Occupy movement, I urge you, talk to jail, talk to Pericles and the Arcos. They can do a better job about this than I can. But I do think if we employ a complementary range of strategies that don't focus on DC, we're going to be much more effective than if we do.